In the spring of 1945, as Hitler's Reich crumbled into ruins across a devastated Europe, the war in the Pacific had yet to reach its bloody climax. The Americans had pushed the Japanese back, island by island, until all that remained of the once vast Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was the Ryukyus and the home islands themselves. For the men aboard the Bayfield-class attack transport USS Goodhue, however, the true test of their courage and endurance was only beginning. The strategic calculus was brutal in its simplicity. Okinawa had to fall before the final invasion of Japan could begin, but the cost of taking this small piece of coral and volcanic rock would prove staggering. 36 ships sent to the bottom, nearly 10,000 sailors dead or wounded, and the ground forces paying an even more terrible price. The Army would count 4,600 dead and 19,000 wounded, while the Marines, who bore the heaviest burden in the savage fighting ashore, would suffer nearly 19,000 casualties. These numbers posed a terrifying question. If the Japanese fought this desperately for Okinawa, what fresh hell awaited the invasion forces when they stormed the beaches of the home islands? Operation Iceberg, as the Okinawa campaign was codenamed, had been conceived in the autumn of 1944. At the same moment, the USS Goodhue was being commissioned into service. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had debated their strategic options endlessly. Should they bypass the Philippines entirely, advance through China, or seize Formosa instead? In the end, they chose a multi-pronged approach. Landings in the Philippines, followed by the seizure of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. On April 1, 1945, while operations continued in the Philippines, and after the costly triumph at Iwo Jima, American forces splashed ashore on Okinawa's beaches. It was Easter Sunday, and while thoughts of resurrection and hope might have crossed the minds of some American servicemen, the Japanese had only one thought: to stop the American advance by any means necessary, no matter how many lives it cost. The Japanese High Command had wrestled with how best to defend Okinawa. Some argued for an immediate, aggressive counterattack the moment the Americans landed. Others advocated a more patient strategy: let them come ashore, then bleed them white in a grinding battle of attrition. But there was a third option, darker and more desperate than the others: the massed waves of suicide aircraft and boats known as kamikaze. In the end, it was this combination of attrition and suicide attacks that American soldiers and sailors would face in the waters around Okinawa. The kamikaze was not entirely new to the Americans. Scattered attacks had occurred as early as 1943, when Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi had developed the concept as a last-ditch effort to inflict crippling damage on the U.S. Navy's aircraft carriers and major warships. The hope was that such desperate measures might slow or even halt the American advance. But nothing the Americans had experienced before could have prepared them for the fury and intensity of the mass kamikaze attacks that would descend upon the fleet off Okinawa like a swarm of hornets defending their nest. Ward McDonald, a 17-year-old signalman from Seattle, Washington, remembered the Goodhue shakedown cruise off San Pedro, California, in December 1944 with a mixture of humor and anxiety. Early one morning, the ship got underway and steamed down the California coast. During gunnery practice against a towed target, the ship's 5-inch guns managed to get a shell within a quarter mile of the target. Hardly an impressive performance. They swung the compass, practiced basic maneuvers, and spent considerable time swabbing vomit from the decks as the boys from Nebraska surrendered their breakfasts to the rolling Pacific swells. McDonald wondered if they would even be allowed to join other ships for the real war. Somehow, they made it through the shakedown successfully. The Goodhue was armed with 2 5-inch dual-purpose gun mounts, one forward and one aft, along with 2 single and 2 twin 40mm anti-aircraft guns and 18 20mm guns to protect the 51 officers and 524 enlisted men aboard. She could carry everything necessary for an amphibious assault: 1,200 troops and 15 landing craft. A single General Electric geared drive turbine generated 8,500 horsepower to drive the ship through the water. In the days immediately following the shakedown, McDonald noticed large boxes of foul weather gear being loaded aboard. It appeared they were headed for a cold climate, perhaps the Aleutians or northern Japan. But when the Goodhue steamed southwest instead of north, McDonald realized the truth. The foul weather gear had been a deception. a bit of theater to make it appear obvious they were heading north while their actual destination lay in the tropics. The Goodhue departed the west coast on January 4, 1945, with her cargo holds full. She arrived at the Admiralty Islands on January 21st, where she took on additional cargo and passengers before pushing on to Hollandia, New Guinea. On February 4th, Captain J.L. Allen came aboard as the ship's new commander, and under his leadership, the Goodhue became the flagship of Transport Division 51. This distinction was both an honor and a curse. It meant they would lead the column in any action, making them the most vulnerable to attack. The ship made her way to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, arriving on February 12th with supplies for the bases there. For the next 2 weeks, officers and men underwent vigorous amphibious training exercises. By the end of February, they were loading troops and supplies for the coming campaign against Okinawa. More practice landings followed, and then, on March 21st, the ship got underway for the real thing. But there would be one more stop along the way. The small islands of Kurama-Redo, just south of Okinawa, had to be secured first to serve as a staging area for the main invasion. On March 26th, a mighty American armada, with the Goodhue among its ranks, put troops ashore to secure the island group. Compared to what lay ahead, the Kurama-Redo landings were almost easy. But even so, McDonald voiced the opinion of many American servicemen when he said that March 26, 1945, was when hell descended upon them in every fashion. From the water came the dreaded suicide boats, from the air the deadly kamikaze, and on the beaches awaited the fanatics. There would be no respite for anyone. In the next 30 days alone, they would encounter 80 terror attacks, most of them kamikaze. The reason for all this attention was simple. They were getting very close to the main Japanese strongholds, and the enemy would throw everything they had at the Americans. As the kamikaze attacks intensified, the sailors aboard the Goodhue improvised by bringing up on deck several of the Army's field guns they were transporting. The suicide boats, McDonald said, just seemed to appear out of nowhere, and if you weren't alert, they would get beneath your gunnery field and detonate their charges, blowing a sizable hole in the side of the vessel at the waterline. On April 1st, the Goodhue was anchored off Kubishima as the main landings against Okinawa went in. More than 1,300 vessels had assembled off the island. Landing craft were lowered and circled in the water while the pre-landing barrage softened up the beaches beginning at 5:30 in the morning. 64 American aircraft from the nearby carrier group also attacked the island before the landing craft hit the beaches. By day's end, a 15,000-yard beachhead had been secured and thousands of troops had landed. At 4:15 in the afternoon on April 2nd, the Goodhue got underway from Kubishima to deliver the 307th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 77th Division to its destination on Okinawa. The transports cruised in a 3-column formation, with the Goodhue leading the right column and the transports Telfair, Montreal, Drew, and Montrose following at 1,200-yard intervals. The columns were separated by 600 yards. The Goodhue kept pace, with the guide ship Chilton leading the center column and Henrico leading the left. As they approached the combat zone, the vessels began zigzagging to avoid enemy submarines lurking in the depths. At approximately 6:30 that evening, a dozen kamikazes attacked the small armada of transports and their destroyer escorts. The Goodhue's log recorded the moment with clinical precision. At 6:37 p.m., they commenced firing with the after starboard 20mm and 40mm guns on enemy aircraft attacking from abaft the starboard beam. At 6:40, the Henrico was seen to be hit in the midship section. At 6:42, the Telfair was grazed by a suicide plane. 3 planes attacked the Goodhue and her sister ship Telfair. The combined fire from both ships' gunners destroyed one of the attackers in midair, the plane disintegrating in a ball of flame. A second plane rammed into the starboard and port king posts of the Telfair, then tumbled over the side into the sea. The third plane was headed straight for the Goodhue. Radioman Second Class Jack Kenewell recalled what happened next with vivid clarity. After knocking one Betty bomber out of the air with a salvo from their 5-inch gun aft, a Japanese suicide plane came in over their bow only seconds later. They didn't have a chance. It hit their crow's nest and did considerable damage. Kenewell was bleeding badly with wounds on his chest, neck, and feet. The Goodhue's log recorded the final moments of the attack. At 6:48, one enemy plane was observed paralleling their course to starboard at 3,000 yards. The plane changed to an approach course at approximately 1,000 feet altitude. The forward 5-inch gun took it under fire at a range of 1,500 yards. The aircraft attacking the Goodhue was a Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, known to the Allies by the code name Nick. This twin-engine, long-range escort and reconnaissance fighter was most likely armed with 2 fragmentation bombs carried under its wings. The combined fire from the Goodhue and the other transports hit the Nick in the port engine and cockpit area, setting it ablaze. At 6:50, the suicide plane crashed into the mainmast at the crosstrees level. One part of the aircraft continued over the ship and exploded over the fantail, while the other part, containing the cockpit and at least one bomb, swung over the port side and exploded at about deck level. Most of the plane fell flaming into the water. McDonald vividly recalled the attack in his mind's eye. As soon as he stepped out onto the main deck, he looked right into the cockpit of a kamikaze approaching on the starboard side. He watched wide-eyed as the Japanese plane plowed into the starboard side of the USS Henrico, blowing a hell of a hole completely through the superstructure. He was looking at the crew of a 5-inch gun about 10 feet away when their eyes grew huge and an expression of pure fear struck them all. From the corner of his eye, he caught sight of a huge ball of fire and mass descending upon him. Instinctively, he turned to his left and ducked. In those brief moments captured by the ship's log and the memories of Kenewell and McDonald, 27 men were killed and 117 wounded. Although the kamikaze's impact had struck and knocked down the Goodhue's 30-ton cargo boom, the majority of the dead and wounded were hit when bomb fragments and shrapnel rained down on them as the plane disintegrated above the ship. The Telfair, Henrico, and Chilton had also sustained major damage. The destroyer Dickenson had taken a direct hit on its bridge, killing 53 sailors, including the captain. The ship was so seriously damaged that it later had to be scuttled. The Henrico had also taken a direct hit from a suicide plane, later identified as a Francis twin-engine bomber. This kamikaze had plowed into the superstructure, killing the captain, a colonel of the 77th Division, and scores of Navy and Army personnel in an instant. Stunned but miraculously unwounded, McDonald was taken below for a time to recover from the shock. When he regained his senses and returned to the deck, he found death and destruction everywhere he turned. The first thing he noticed was that the after 5-inch gun placement was twisted out of kilter, and there were no identifiable body parts of any of the gun crew. They were just gone, vaporized by the explosion. Screams and moaning filled the air. Orders were being shouted and bodies lay everywhere. As he peered over the top of a ladder onto the deck, he saw a finger with a gold ring still on it, just lying there among a mass of flesh scattered across the deck. Radarman 3rd Class Samuel Kills Brockington had been drafted into the Navy from Kingstree, South Carolina, in March 1944 and assigned to the Goodhue that summer. He remembered that the man in the crow's nest where the plane hit was just wrapped in twisted metal, and pieces of the plane were embedded in the boat. Damage control parties worked frantically to extinguish several fires before beginning the grim task of collecting the dead and wounded. Radarman 3rd Class Howard G. Hobbs was assigned to this detail, and the memories of the sights and sounds of that evening haunted him for the rest of his life. Motor Machinist Mate 3rd Class Francis Red Nagel was in charge of piloting one of the landing craft used to ferry troops and supplies to Okinawa. On the day the Goodhue was attacked, he recalled looking into the sky and seeing what appeared to be hundreds of kamikaze planes filling the air like a swarm of angry wasps. The Goodhue's loss had been devastating. With 21 dead and more than 100 sailors wounded, the transport had lost 1/4 of its crew in a matter of minutes. 24 soldiers from the 307th Regiment also became casualties. At least 5 of the 15 attack transports that left Kurumaredo that evening sustained damage from kamikaze attacks. During the entire Okinawa campaign, 27 of the 36 U.S. ships sunk had been victims of suicide plane attacks. A total of 371 U.S. ships were damaged at Okinawa, and kamikaze attacks were estimated to have accounted for 164 of them. After the attack of April 2nd, the Goodhue withdrew with a destroyer escort back to the Kurumaredo anchorage for repairs. Along the way, the dead were buried on the small island of Zamamishima with full military honors, and the wounded were transferred to hospital ships for treatment. Rockington remembered working on the injured that night, doing everything he could to help. The next day, they were sent to the hospital ships. He helped sew canvas bags for those who were dead, including a young man from Tennessee he had been talking to the evening before the attack, which was the evening of the invasion on Okinawa. The soldier had said, "Brock, if we get home, let's do so and so." Rockington had told him that the invasion that morning had gone well, and instead of saying, "if we get home," they should say, "when we get home." The soldier had agreed that sounded like a good idea. Rockington sewed his body bag the next day. Kenewell, who had received serious wounds when the Japanese plane struck the ship, recalled the condition of the sailors on the hospital ship around him. He saw some horribly mutilated men, some with shrapnel embedded all over their bodies, others with terrible burns. These were undoubtedly the worst cases, some with no chance of recovery, dying by inches in their bunks. Some had their eyes burned right out of their sockets and would never really recover. After several days of rest at the anchorage, the troops aboard the Goodhue eventually went ashore on Okinawa to continue the fight. The USS Goodhue received 1 battle star for its participation in the Okinawa campaign. The ship was decommissioned on April 5, 1946, and sold to the U.S. Maritime Commission for commercial service in 1947. Renamed the Hawaiian Citizen, she plied the Pacific Ocean for another 34 years, 21 of those as a container ship. The Hawaiian Citizen was finally scrapped in Taiwan in 1982. The ship is gone now, but many of her veterans are still around. They gather every year for a reunion and mourn the shipmates lost in the previous year. The ordeal of the USS Goodhue is not unique among the U.S. Navy warships subjected to the ferocious kamikaze assaults off Okinawa. However, it stands as a representative example of the battle that took place there and of the carnage that could well have been expected if an invasion of the Japanese home islands had been necessary. The ship and her crew paid their price in blood and fire, and their story remains a testament to the courage and sacrifice of ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances during the closing chapters of the Second World War.